Boston, 1852. Winter winds coiled like knives through the narrow streets of Beacon Hill, carrying the scent of coal smoke and damp stone. Atop the hill stood a mansion of pale brick and black shutters, a house that loomed larger in rumor than in reality. It belonged to Margaret Whitmore, the widow of a shipping magnate whose fortune had carved her place among Boston's elite. The house itself seemed alive. Its tall windows stared out like watchful eyes, its long corridors echoed with steps even when no one walked them, and its walls carried whispers of tragedies past. To the families who lived nearby, the Whitmore estate was both a symbol of power and a shadowed reminder that wealth could not guard against misfortune. Margaret Whitmore was known for her composure at society balls, her dark silks, and the heavy pearls at her throat. Yet behind the cold elegance was a hunger, an obsession that she carried like a private fever. 3 daughters lived under her roof, young and fair, with hair as pale as moonlight and eyes as deep as pools. They should have been the envy of Boston's suitors, but they were not. Suitors came, yes, drawn by wealth and beauty, yet they left quickly, whispering excuses, citing sudden business or unexplainable dread. It was as though something unseen drove them away. By the spring of 1852, it became clear none of her daughters would marry into Boston's finest families. At night, Margaret would pace the grand hall lined with portraits of stern Whitmore ancestors. She would pause before her husband's painting, a man who had conquered seas and storms, and mutter that his name would not die with her. Her family must endure, no matter the cost. And so the plan began to take shape, a plan born not of love, but of desperation. She would buy heirs the way merchants bought ships and cargo. She would use her wealth as a weapon, her gold as a lure, and her dough. Eliza dreamed of leaving Boston altogether, running to the sea with some ship's captain who would not care for society's whispers. Anne, too frail to imagine escape, often wept alone, clutching her rosary. Their mother's obsession was a presence in every room. She kept ledgers, not only of accounts and investments, but of suitors and prospects. Pages filled with notes about men who had once shown interest and then withdrawn. "Weak men," she would mutter, slamming the book shut. The daughters felt the weight of her despair. They knew they were pawns in a game they did not understand, bound to a plan not yet revealed. And so, in the great mansion on Beacon Hill, they learned silence. Silence at the table, silence in the drawing room, silence in their prayers. But silence has its limits. One evening, Eliza broke it. In their shared chamber, she whispered to Clara, "Mother will sell us before she lets us go free." Anne gasped. Clara hushed her quickly. But deep down, she knew her sister's words carried the taste of truth. The silence in the Whitmore house was not merely of manners. It was the silence of daughters who sensed the storm their mother was summoning. Boston society in 1852 was merciless. A family's reputation could rise or fall in the span of a season, and the Whitmores had already begun to fall. At every gathering, Margaret paraded her daughters in silks and jewels, their pale faces powdered, their hair arranged with painstaking care. Yet when the violins played and the dance began, the Whitmore girls stood at the edges of the ballroom, partners scarce. Gentlemen bowed politely, but rarely asked for more than a single turn across the floor. And when they left quickly, avoiding Margaret's piercing gaze. The whispers began in drawing rooms and parlors. Some said the girls were cursed, that their father's wealth had been gained through dishonorable trading. Others claimed madness ran in their blood, pointing to Anne's sickly state as proof. No one spoke these things to Margaret's face, but she felt them in the way conversations shifted when she entered a room, in the subtle retreat of families who once welcomed her warmly. For Clara, the rejection stung like a hidden wound. She dreamed of a home of her own, of children, of love that was not dictated by wealth or standing. Yet she saw, night after night, the way men turned from her. Eliza grew bitter, mocking the suitors who dared approach only to vanish again. Anne withdrew further, retreating into her prayers and faint smiles. One winter evening, at a reception in a grand townhouse on Mount Vernon Street, Margaret overheard a conversation not meant for her ears. 2 matrons whispered behind their fans, their eyes fixed on her daughters. "They're beautiful, yes, but no good man would tie his blood to theirs. Haven't you heard? The Whitmores bring ruin." Margaret's blood ran cold, but she forced a smile, carrying herself with the same pride that had always been her armor. That night, as the carriage carried them home, she sat in silence, her gloved hands gripping her lap so tightly that the pearls at her wrist bit into her skin. By the time they reached the mansion, she had made her decision. If Boston's fine men would not marry her daughters, she would find another way. The Whitmore name would not end. Her daughters would bear children, whether society approved or not. And so, beneath the glow of gas lamps, as snow began to fall upon Beacon Hill, Margaret Whitmore hardened her heart. Society had refused her family. Now she would refuse society. Margaret Whitmore had always believed herself to be a woman of vision. Where others saw obstacles, she saw paths. Where others bent under the weight of gossip, she straightened her spine and let the rumors slide from her silks like rain off stone. Yet now, in the winter of 1852, the walls of her mansion pressed inward, and she could no longer ignore the truth. Boston had turned its back on her family. Her daughters were no longer prospects, they were burdens. Each day that passed without engagement meant another step closer to ruin. She would not allow it. She would not permit the Whitmore bloodline to vanish into obscurity, erased by the pettiness of a society too cowardly to embrace her girls. Margaret spent long evenings at her desk in the study, the ledger of suitors open before her. She ran her fingers down the pages of crossed-out names, recalling each rejection, each failure. Weak men, cowards, fools. But wealth could buy what pride could not. Wealth had built her house, furnished her halls, and carved her name into the very stones of Beacon Hill. Why should it not buy heirs? The plan unfolded with chilling clarity. She would pay discreetly as her husband had owed. Pence paid smugglers and shipmen, gold for silence, silver for secrecy. Young men could always be found on the docks or in the taverns, men with strong bodies, desperate for coin, unburdened by questions of honor. Her daughters need not agree. They need not understand. It was not their place to shape the future of the Whitmores. That duty belonged to her alone. She told herself it was love, that she was saving them from the shame of spinsterhood, from the slow suffocation of a wasted life. Yet deep within, another truth pulsed. It was not love, but obsession, a hunger to see her name survive no matter the cost. On a frigid January night, Margaret rose from her desk, her decision sealed. She walked through the silent corridors, pausing at each daughter's door. She touched the wood lightly, as though blessing it with her intent. Soon, each would serve the legacy she had chosen for them. Outside, the bells of Boston tolled midnight. Inside, a widow's heart beat with ruthless purpose. The decision had been made, and nothing, not daughter's tears, not society's scorn, not even God's judgment, would turn her from it. The Whitmore mansion had always been a place of refinement, polished wood, velvet curtains, and the faint scent of rosewater drifting through its halls. But on a bitter February night in 1852, refinement gave way to secrecy. Margaret Whitmore prepared to carry out the first step of her plan. The arrangements had been made quietly. A sailor from the docks, young, strong, and desperate for coin, had been chosen. He would not ask questions. He would not speak of what happened within those walls. Margaret had ensured his silence with more gold than a man of his station could hope to earn in a year. The sailor arrived through the servants' entrance, led by Margaret herself. His boots tracked mud upon the marble, his coat smelled of salt and smoke, and his eyes darted nervously across the grandeur of the house. Yet when Margaret placed a heavy purse in his hands, his hesitation melted into greed. Clara was the first, the eldest daughter, obedient, resigned. She had sensed her mother's intentions long before this night, though she had prayed she was wrong. When the door to her chamber opened, and the sailor stepped inside, her heart sank to ash. "No," she whispered, backing toward her bed. "Mother, please." Margaret's face was cold, her voice sharper than ice. "This is for the family, Clara, for your future. You will not shame us with refusal." The sailor lingered awkwardly, but Margaret's gaze was harder than iron. He obeyed the unspoken command. The door closed. Clara's sobs echoed through the chamber, muffled by thick walls that had witnessed generations of Whitmores before her. Downstairs, Margaret sat in the parlour, hands folded neatly, as though waiting for a guest at tea. She ignored the sounds above, the muffled cries, the footsteps, the silence that followed. She poured herself a glass of brandy, her face expressionless. To her, this was not cruelty, it was necessity. When the sailor descended the stairs an hour later, he would not meet her eyes. He took the rest of his payment and vanished into the night, his shadow swallowed by the snow. Clara remained in her chamber, broken, silent, her innocence stripped away not by choice but by transaction. And Margaret, standing alone in the grand hallway, whispered to herself as though to the portraits of her ancestors, "It has begun." Writing the Whitmore mansion seemed quieter after the first night, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a house holding its breath. Clara did not come down for breakfast, her pale face hidden behind her chamber door. Margaret excused her absence with a polite lie about illness, though the servants traded glances that betrayed they knew better. Margaret wasted no time. She had tasted control, and the fear of losing her family's name had hardened into certainty. What she had done once, she would do again. She began to walk the streets near the harbour herself, veiled in heavy black, her carriage waiting discreetly nearby. She sought men not of Boston's fine parlours, but of the alleys and taverns, men with nothing to lose, men who would take gold and vanish into the fog. One evening she found him. He was not a sailor but a drifter, tall and lean, with eyes like dark glass. He spoke little, accepted the offer with the hunger of a starving wolf, and followed her carriage without hesitation. He was perfect, Margaret thought, because he seemed to care for nothing at all. This time it was Eliza, the second daughter. Unlike Clara, Eliza did not submit in silence. When Margaret forced her into the room with the stranger, she fought like a wild thing, clawing at the door, screaming until her throat burned raw. But Margaret was stronger than her grief-stricken child. She locked the door herself and stood outside, listening as her daughter's cries turned to muffled sobs, then to silence. The stranger left in the early hours of the morning, his pockets heavy with coin. Unlike the sailor, he did not look away from Margaret. He held her gaze for a long, chilling moment at the threshold, as if to say he understood the darkness of what she commanded. Then he vanished into the Boston fog. For days afterward, Eliza would not speak to her mother. She lay in her bed, her body rigid, her eyes glassy with hatred. When Clara tried to comfort her, Eliza turned away, her voice little more than a whisper. "She sold me. She sold us both." The youngest, Anne, watched all of this with wide, terrified eyes. She was too young, too frail, and yet she knew her turn was coming. At night she prayed in a whisper so soft it barely reached her own ears. "God save us from her," she pleaded, clutching her rosary until her knuckles bled. But Margaret was unmoved. To her, the daughter's tears and protests were childish tantrums, obstacles on the path to legacy. Each night she reminded herself, wealth had bought this house, wealth would buy heirs, and one day society would look upon the Whitmore name with reverence again. Yet the mansion was already changing. The servants whispered of footsteps in the halls at night, footsteps too heavy to be Clara's or Eliza's. They swore they heard doors creaking open and closing again, though Margaret ordered every lock checked. And once, a maid fled screaming from the nursery, swearing she heard an infant's cry, though no child had yet been born. Margaret silenced them all with threats and coin. But deep within the walls of the Beacon Hill mansion, something else had awakened, something that neither gold nor iron will could contain. Writing the Whitmore mansion, once alive with the bustling rhythm of servants' footsteps and the clatter of porcelain at tea, had grown heavy with dread. Whispers now traveled faster than commands. The maids carried them down the long corridors, the butler murmured them in the kitchen, and even the stable boy spoke of them when tending the horses at dawn. At first, the whispers were about the sailor, the rough-looking man who had entered through the servants' entrance on a snow-bitten night and left with a pouch of gold. Then they were about the drifter, the stranger with eyes that gleamed like coal, who had walked the marble halls as though they belonged to him. Such men did not belong in a house like Whitmore's, and the staff knew it. Soon the gossip grew darker. A maid claimed she had passed Clara's door and heard muffled sobs long after midnight. Another swore she had seen Eliza clawing at her window as though she wanted to leap from it. And young Anne, sweet, trembling Anne, was said to wander the halls with her rosary clutched to her chest, praying until her lips bled. But the most chilling whispers were not about the daughters. They were about the house itself. A footman swore he had heard a baby's cry in the nursery, though every cradle in that room lay empty beneath dust sheets. A cook claimed she saw the shadow of a man pass across the stairwell when all the gentlemen of the house had long gone. One maid fainted outright when she swore she saw a pale figure rocking in the nursery chair, though no one else was there when Margaret herself stormed in to prove her wrong. Margaret crushed these tales with a sharp tongue. "Superstition," she hissed, dismissing them with the authority of a woman who had commanded ships and fortunes through her late husband. A household does not run on ghost stories but on discipline. And yet, she noticed things too. Doors left ajar that she was certain she had closed, the sound of footsteps when she walked alone at night, a lingering smell of smoke and salt air in the guest wing, though the sailor had been gone for weeks. The servants' whispers grew bolder. Some threatened to leave, while others demanded higher wages to stay in a house they called cursed. Margaret paid those who were greedy and dismissed those who trembled. She thought herself in control, her iron will unbreakable, but each whisper was like a crack in the walls of her grand deception. With every passing day, it became harder to silence not just her household, but the shadows creeping through it. And the daughters, once bound by silence, began to look at their mother, not with fear alone, but with the kind of hatred that seeds rebellion. The mansion itself seemed to listen, feeding on whispers, storing them like kindling for a fire yet to come. Margaret Whitmore sat at her writing desk, the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight against the winter night. Before her lay not just ledgers of coin, but a new book of her own making, a journal in which she recorded the progress of her legacy. Each daughter's name was written with meticulous care, followed by notes of her health, her temperament, and whether signs of child had begun to show. To Margaret, it was not cruelty but science, a methodical preservation of the Whitmore bloodline. To anyone else, it was madness written in ink. Clara had grown pale, her eyes hollow, her body sluggish. She did not speak much, save in whispers to Eliza, and Margaret noticed she flinched at the sound of her mother's footsteps. Eliza, once fiery and outspoken, had become restless, pacing the halls, muttering of escape. Margaret wrote beside her name, "Defiant, watch closely." Anne remained fragile, coughing in the cold, her rosary always in her hands. Margaret dismissed her youngest as too delicate, perhaps useless. A note scribbled in sharp letters across the page. The journal became her gospel. Each entry justified her choices, each ink blot another nail in the coffin of her daughter's innocence. Margaret told herself it was duty, yet she began to speak to the book as though it answered. At night she read her entries aloud by candlelight, whispering into the shadows, as though her long-dead husband sat beside her, nodding in approval. But the shadows did not nod. They shifted. They whispered back. Margaret began to hear voices when she wrote, soft, infant cries, low murmurs of men she had paid, the sound of prayers muttered through clenched teeth. At first she thought it imagination, but when she slammed the book shut, the whispers lingered, curling in the corners of the room like smoke. Her mind split between pride and dread. She dreamed of strong heirs bearing the Whitmore name, but she also dreamed of children born with black eyes, of daughters screaming in labor, while unseen hands rocked empty cradles. Her daughters saw the change too. Margaret's eyes grew wild, her speech sharp and strange. Once, she struck Eliza across the face for refusing to eat, declaring, "Your womb is not yours, girl. It belongs to the Whitmores." Clara wept silently that night, and Anne prayed harder, whispering that their mother was no longer their mother at all. The mansion fed on Margaret's descent, where once it echoed with the laughter of servants and the music of soirees, it now pulsed with muttered prayers, suppressed sobs, and Margaret's relentless scratching pen. It was no longer just a house, it had become an asylum, built not of stone and iron, but of Margaret's bloodline and her madness. Writing the nursery at the Whitmore mansion had once been a place of hope. Years before, when Margaret's husband still lived, it had been prepared with care, soft blue wallpaper patterned with swans, a cradle carved from mahogany, shelves filled with toys shipped from Europe. But no child had ever slept there. After years of emptiness, the room became a museum of expectation, dust gathering, where joy had never taken root. Now, as winter deepened in 1852, the nursery came alive again, but not in the way Margaret had planned. It began with sounds. Clara was the first to hear them, a faint rattling of the cradle, though no one had entered the room. One night she swore she heard the soft cooing of an infant, rising and falling as though a mother soothed it to sleep. When she told Eliza, her sister laughed bitterly at first, but the next evening Eliza herself froze in terror when she heard the same lullaby, sung in a voice she swore was not human. Anne avoided the room altogether, clutching her rosary whenever she passed its door. "There are children in there," she whispered one night, eyes wide. "Not ours, not hers, something else." The servants confirmed the stories. A maid assigned to clean the nursery fled in tears, insisting she had seen the cradle rocking by itself, the carved swans on the wallpaper seeming to move as if swimming across the walls. Another servant claimed to have seen a shadow sitting in the rocker, swaying back and forth, though the chair was empty when he looked again. Margaret dismissed them all with icy fury. "Fools," she snapped. "You mistake drafts for ghosts, rocking chairs for phantoms. Shall I let the fate of this house be dictated by the superstitions of servants?" Yet her eyes betrayed her fear, for though she spoke of reason, Margaret herself had begun to hear the cries. One night, unable to resist, she entered the nursery alone. The fire had gone out, and the air was so cold her breath hung in the darkness. She lit a single candle, its light trembling across the cradle. The mahogany wood gleamed, and the sheets inside were rumpled as if a child had just been laid to rest. And then she heard it. A baby's cry, shrill and piercing, filled the room. Margaret clutched the cradle, her hands shaking. But there was no baby. The cradle was empty. The sound came from everywhere, echoing through the walls, growing louder, until it seemed the very plaster itself was screaming. She staggered back, clutching her chest, whispering, "No, this is my mind. Only my mind." The cry stopped abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise itself. In that silence, Margaret swore she heard another sound, laughter, low and mocking, as though the house itself was amused by her torment. From that night onward, the nursery was never quiet. Whether it was the creak of the rocker, the rustle of unseen footsteps, or the lull of voices no living throat sang, the room became the heart of the mansion's haunting. For the daughters, the nursery became a place of dread. For the servants, it was a curse. And for Margaret, though she would never admit it aloud, it was proof that her obsession had awakened something inhuman. The house on Beacon Hill no longer belonged to the Whitmores alone. It now belonged to the shadows in the nursery. Writing. By the spring of 1853, the Whitmore mansion was steeped in an air so heavy that even the servants walked the halls with lowered eyes and trembling hands. The whispers about Margaret's scheme had spread beyond the walls, first among the maids and footmen, then through the kitchens of Boston, until even merchants appeared. The marketplace spoke in hushed tones of the widow who sought heirs by unnatural means, but the greatest horror unfolded not outside the mansion, but within. Clara, the eldest, grew pale and heavy with child. Her body bent beneath the burden Margaret had forced upon her, and her eyes seemed distant, haunted by the memory of the night her innocence was traded away. She never smiled, never spoke of the life within her. At night, Eliza often found her staring at the nursery door, her hands clutching her swollen belly, as though she feared what might emerge from it. Eliza herself had begun to change. Though not yet with child, her monthly cycles had ceased, and Margaret watched her with the sharp eyes of a vulture. "Soon," the widow whispered one night, clutching her daughter's chin, "soon you will carry what is destined for this family." Eliza spat at her feet, her defiance burning brighter than ever, but Margaret only laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut. Anne, the youngest, trembled at the sight of both sisters. Their suffering broke her spirit, yet she clung to prayer as her shield. She claimed that in her dreams she saw infants crawling through the halls, infants with hollow eyes and mouths that opened wide not to cry, but to laugh. And then the curse made itself known. Clara's pregnancy was marked not by the natural rhythms of life, but by grotesque signs. Her belly moved unnaturally, as if hands pressed against it from inside. At night, she screamed that the child was clawing at her womb, begging to be released. Eliza, trying to soothe her, laid her hand upon her sister's stomach and recoiled when she felt a violent jolt, as if something inside had kicked not with the strength of a baby, but with the force of a grown man. Margaret, instead of fear, felt triumph. "Stronger than any child born of common love," she declared, her eyes wild with zeal. "This is the proof of our destiny. This child will carry the Whitmore blood into eternity." But the servants began to whisper of the pregnant curse. They claimed the unborn child was no blessing, but a punishment summoned by Margaret's greed. They spoke of the nursery's phantom cries as omens, warning that what grew within Clara was not human at all. One maid, trembling, confessed to Eliza that she had seen Clara's reflection in the mirror shift, her belly gone, her body gaunt, but her arms cradling a black-eyed infant that was not there in reality. Eliza dismissed it aloud, but in her heart, fear took root. The house itself began to change. Doors creaked open without cause, mirrors cracked without being touched, and the sound of lullabies twisted into wails of anguish. When Margaret walked the halls, she no longer seemed like a grieving widow, but like a priestess of some dark rite, her journal clutched to her chest, her mutterings echoing as if she prayed to forces unseen. Clara's screams became nightly ritual. The mansion quaked with them, and yet Margaret forbade the doctor from coming, convinced no man of science could understand the sacred work unfolding in her bloodline. "This is not a sickness," she hissed. "It is creation." But Eliza, watching her sister wither beneath the curse, began to wonder if their family was not creating life, but birthing something that should never exist. Writing, Boston, 1853. The Whitmore mansion had grown so heavy with dread that even those who passed it on Beacon Hill claimed they felt a chill. Curtains never opened, carriages never lingered long, and the laughter that once marked high society gatherings had been replaced with whispers of curses, madness, and unborn horrors. It was during this time that Dr. Jonathan Hale, a respected physician of the city, was summoned. Margaret had resisted outside interference for months, but Clara's health had worsened beyond what even she could dismiss. The girl could scarcely rise from her bed, her skin translucent as wax, her eyes ringed with dark shadows. Her screams, which came nightly, had grown hoarse and raw. Dr. Hale arrived on a damp morning. The mansion loomed above him, its shutters closed tight against the world. He was greeted not with hospitality but with suspicion. The servants, gaunt and trembling, led him through hallways where the wallpaper seemed to peel like dying flesh, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and blood. When he entered Clara's chamber, he was struck silent. The young woman lay curled upon her bed, her body trembling with every breath. Her belly was grotesquely swollen, her veins dark against her pale skin. As he approached, her eyes fluttered open, and she whispered, "Please, make it stop." Dr. Hale pressed his ear to her stomach. What he heard chilled his very soul. The heartbeat inside was not the steady rhythm of a child. It was rapid, violent, unnatural, as if more than one heart pounded within. He stepped back, his hand trembling. "This is not ordinary," he muttered. "This is monstrous." Margaret entered then, her presence sharp and commanding. "You will not frighten my daughter with talk of monstrosities," she snapped. "She is carrying the future of this family. You will see to it that she survives." But Hale would not be silenced so easily. He turned on Margaret, his voice firm. "What you are doing here is unnatural. I've seen women give birth 100 times, and I tell you, madam, this is no ordinary child. If you persist, you risk not only the life of your daughter, but of everyone in this house." Margaret's lips curled into a smile, thin, cruel. "Doctor," she whispered, "you speak as if you know more than God himself. but I know what grows within her. I have prayed for it, paid for it, demanded it. This house will not die with me." Hale's hands shook as he gathered his instruments. He dared to lean close to Clara again, but this time her belly shifted beneath the sheets as though something inside pressed outward against the skin. His breath caught. He saw for a fleeting second the outline of a hand, or was it a claw, pressing through before retreating. Clara screamed, and the sound echoed like a cry from the grave. The doctor recoiled, dropping his stethoscope. "This is not medicine," he gasped. "This is blasphemy." Margaret's eyes flared with fury. She seized him by the arm and dragged him toward the door. "You will say nothing of this," she hissed, her voice low, dangerous. "You will take your warnings and bury them. If you speak a word to anyone in Boston, I will ruin you. Do you understand?" But Hale did not cower. At the threshold he turned to the daughters, his voice carrying over Margaret's threats. "Leave this house if you value your souls. What grows within these walls will not be a child, it will be a curse." With that, he stormed into the night, leaving behind a house trembling with secrets and a widow more determined than ever to bring her vision to life. That night, Clara's screams returned. But this time, beneath her cries, the others swore they heard another voice, a deeper one, gurgling, laughing, from inside her womb. Writing. The summer of 1853 dragged itself across Boston like a fever, streets baked under the sun, the air thick with rot from the harbor, but no place felt more suffocating than the Whitmore mansion. Its once grand windows stayed shuttered, trapping the heat inside, and its hallways became dim tunnels where whispers crept like smoke. Clara was near her time. Her body, once delicate, had become unrecognizable, stretched thin by the burden within her. Her belly jutted forward unnaturally, its shape uneven, grotesque, as though more than one child fought for space. Her skin bore bruises from within, long purple streaks like claw marks. When she moved, the motions beneath her flesh were so violent that Eliza swore she saw ribs shift and bend. Eliza had begun to keep vigil at her sister's bedside. Though her defiance against Margaret burned as fiercely as ever, fear softened her edges. She wiped Clara's sweat, sang to her in the darkest hours, and tried to silence her sobs when she begged for death. At times, Clara whispered that something inside her was watching, that she could feel its eyes on her heart, its breath against her lungs. Anne grew quieter with each passing day, her prayers growing longer, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. She confessed to Eliza that she had dreamt of the birth, of Clara bleeding out while Margaret laughed, and the cradle in the nursery filled itself with shadows. The servants were restless, their fear almost visible. Many threatened to leave, muttering of the devil's child, but Margaret bound them with coin and threats. "If you run," she warned, "Boston will know you as liars and none will hire you again." Still, more than one maid disappeared in the night, leaving only abandoned aprons and half-packed trunks in their quarters. Margaret herself seemed transformed, her journals filled with frenzy. Deed writings, not only of bloodlines and legacy, but of prophecies. She wrote of a child who would outlive generations, whose birth would tear down the boundaries between the living and the dead. At times, she was seen speaking aloud to the nursery walls, as if reciting prayers in a tongue unknown. One night, Clara's cries grew so fierce that the entire mansion stirred. Eliza rushed to her side and nearly collapsed at the sight. Her sister's stomach rippled violently, as though hands pressed from the inside. Clara clawed at the sheets, gasping, "It's coming too soon. Oh God, it's trying to come out now." Margaret entered, her face cold but her eyes alight with something feverish. She laid her hand upon her daughter's stomach and closed her eyes, as though in reverence. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, my darling. The time is nearly here." Eliza shoved her away. "You'll kill her. She can't survive this." But Margaret only smiled. She was born to survive it. Her suffering is the price of immortality. The house itself seemed to groan that night. Floorboards creaked though no one walked them, doors slammed without touch, and the nursery echoed with the sound of a lullaby sung by no human throat. As dawn crept into the sky, Clara fell into a fragile sleep, but the silence was no comfort. Eliza sat at her side, her eyes fixed on her sister's belly. For though Clara's breathing was steady, the skin across her womb still moved, slowly, purposefully, as if the thing inside was awake and waiting. The night came heavy with storm clouds. Thunder rolled over Boston like the growl of some unseen beast, and rain lashed against the shutters of the Whitmore mansion. Inside, candles flickered in trembling pools of light, their flames bending with every groan of the old house. Clara's labor had begun. Her screams tore through the halls, raw and unending, louder even than the thunder outside. Servants rushed in and out of her chamber, carrying buckets of water, cloths, and basins that filled quickly with blood. But no matter how they worked, nothing eased her torment. Eliza clung to her sister's hand, her knuckles white with the strength of her grip. Clara's body twisted with every contraction, her belly moving as though something inside fought against her, pushing not toward life, but toward violent release. "It's not right," Clara sobbed, sweat pouring down her temples. "It's not a child, it's something else." Anne knelt in the corner, clutching her rosary so tightly that blood dripped from her palms. She prayed louder and louder, desperate to drown out the screams, yet each prayer was drowned instead by a chorus of wails echoing from the nursery across the hall. The cradle rocked by itself, its wood creaking with every cry, though no one dared enter to silence it. Margaret presided over it all like a priestess at a dark ritual. Her journal lay open on a table, its pages filled with fresh ink, chants, markings, symbols not of any church, but of something older, more forbidden. Her eyes never left Clara. "Push," she commanded, her voice sharp and cold. "Bring forth what belongs to us." "No!" Eliza shouted, tears streaking her face. "You're killing her. Look at her. She won't survive this." "She will," Margaret hissed, her lips curling in a fevered smile. "She must. The Whitmore legacy demands it." Hours passed. Clara's voice grew hoarse, her body trembling with exhaustion. Blood stained the sheets, soaking through to the floor. Each time she pushed, the lights in the chamber flickered, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Some claimed they saw faces in those shadows, infants, wide-eyed and toothless, reaching with tiny hands. Then, just before dawn, Clara let out a scream that shattered the night. The storm outside silenced, as if in reverence. The servants froze. The cradle in the nursery stopped rocking. Something had come forth. The room reeked of iron and something fouler, something unnatural. Clara collapsed back onto the bed, her chest rising faintly, her eyes glazed. The midwife who had dared assist staggered backward, her face pale, her lips trembling as she whispered, That is not a child." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes ablaze with triumph. On the blood-soaked sheets lay the thing she had long awaited, the beginning of her legacy, or perhaps the end of them all. The birth had not yet come, but the house knew it was only days away. Writing. The chamber was thick with the smell of blood and afterbirth. The storm outside had hushed, leaving the world in a silence so deep that every ragged breath seemed to echo. Clara lay limp on the bed, her chest rising shallowly, her lips cracked and blue. On the sheets beside her lay the thing she had birthed. It was small, the size of a human infant, yet its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers curling like claws, and its head seemed slightly misshapen, crowned with a thin layer of damp black hair. Its eyes, though barely open, gleamed with a strange awareness. When it blinked, the lids did not close fully, leaving its black irises shining in the candlelight. The midwife fled the room with a scream, dropping her bloodied cloths. Anne wailed, her prayers tumbling over themselves, while Eliza stood frozen, her body torn between horror and the instinct to protect her sister. Only Margaret moved forward. Her expression was not of revulsion, but of rapture. She bent low, scooping the slick creature into her arms with a tenderness she had never shown her daughters. "My heir," she whispered, "my perfect Whitmore heir." "Oh, my dear, he thing writhed, issuing a sound that was neither a cry nor a laugh, but something in between, wet, gurgling, almost mocking. Its tiny hand stretched outward, and Margaret gasped in delight when its claw-like fingers curled tightly around hers. "Mother!" Eliza shouted, her voice shaking. "That is not a child, it is an abomination!" Margaret turned on her, her face flushed, her eyes wild. "Silence! Do you not see? Do you not understand? This is what I have labored for, what I have sacrificed for. Bloodline eternal, flesh stronger than any man's, mind sharper than any scholar's. He will carry us beyond death itself." Clara stirred faintly, her voice a cracked whisper. "Kill it, please. Eliza, kill it." But Margaret ignored her dying daughter. She carried the infant thing across the hall into the nursery, placing it in the mahogany cradle that had waited for decades. The cradle rocked gently on its own, as if welcoming its occupant. The room grew colder, the air thick with shadows. The carved swans on the wallpaper seemed to twist their necks toward the cradle, their painted eyes glistening in the flickering light. From the empty corners came soft noises, first like distant baby coos, then swelling into a chorus of wails. Yet none of the sounds came from the child itself. Eliza, trembling, followed Margaret into the nursery. The creature looked up at her from the cradle, its mouth curling into something that was not a smile, not fully. But it knew her. She felt it. It knew each of them. And then it spoke. Not in words any human tongue could shape, but in guttural sounds, broken syllables that formed a rhythm like a chant. Eliza's blood froze. Anne screamed. Clara moaned from the other room. Margaret only knelt beside the cradle, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered to the abomination. "Yes, my son. Speak to me. Teach me." The shadows in the nursery thickened, wrapping the walls, the cradle, and Margaret herself in a shroud of darkness. From that moment on, the Whitmore mansion no longer housed a newborn. It housed something far older, far darker, something that had chosen the cradle as its throne. Writing back in the birthing chamber, Clara clung desperately to life. Her breaths were shallow, each one rasping like dry leaves in the wind. Sweat and blood soaked the sheets beneath her, her body trembling in the aftermath of what it had unleashed. Eliza rushed to her side, leaving the nurser. His shadows behind for only a moment, she knelt beside her sister, taking her cold hand into her own. "Clara, stay with me," she begged, tears streaking her cheeks. "Don't leave me with her. Don't leave me in this house." Clara's lips trembled as she tried to speak. No words came at first, only a choked sob, but then her voice cracked through the silence. "Eliza, you must end it. End what she's brought into this world." Her eyes, glassy and distant, turned toward the nursery door where Margaret cooed over the thing in the cradle. "Promise me." Anne crawled closer. Rosary clutched so tightly the beads dug into her skin. Her prayers faltered as she looked at her sister's ashen face. "God forgive us," she whispered, "but she is right." A cry rang out from the nursery then, not of a baby, but of something deeper, wetter, filled with malice. The sound made the walls quiver, made the candles burn lower, as though the house itself bent to listen. Clara jolted with the sound, her eyes widening in terror. She tried to sit up, but her strength gave way. She coughed violently, blood staining her lips, her chest heaving one last time. With Eliza's hand in hers, she exhaled a final rattling breath. Silence followed. Eliza pressed her forehead to Clara's, sobbing. "I promise," she whispered fiercely. "I swear on your life, I will destroy it." Margaret's voice drifted in from the nursery, low and triumphant, carrying words not meant for mortal tongues. The shadows lengthened across the chamber, sliding like grasping hands toward Clara's still body. The eldest Whitmore daughter was gone. And with her death, Eliza's grief hardened into something sharper, resolve. For the first time, she no longer feared her mother. She hated her. The Whitmore mansion was quiet after Clara's death, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator, watching, waiting. Every corridor seemed to hold its breath. Every candle guttered, as if struggling against an unseen wind. Eliza had not slept since that night. She sat alone in the chamber where Clara had passed, staring at the empty bed. Her sister's last words burned into her mind. "Kill it. End what she's brought into this world." Anne hovered nearby, pale and trembling, her rosary swinging from her hand. Eliza, she whispered, we cannot fight her. Mother is not herself anymore, and that thing, she choked on her words, that thing is not of this earth. But Eliza's grief had calcified into something stronger than fear. Her sister's suffering had carved away the last of her hesitation. I don't care what it is, she hissed. I swore to Clara, and I will not break my word. If I have to burn this house to the ground, I will. From down the hall came the sound of Margaret's lullaby, her voice thick with adoration. She rocked the cradle night and day, feeding the abomination with warm milk and whispered prayers. The creature's voice, those guttural, inhuman chants, now mixed with hers in eerie harmony, echoing through the mansion like a hymn to some ancient god. Eliza began to plan. At first it was only wild thoughts, stealing the child from its cradle, smothering it with a pillow, or casting it into the fire. But each time she imagined it, she saw Clara's face, begging her to make it real. She began hiding knives beneath her skirts, candles of blessed wax in her drawers, and the Bible beneath her pillow. Anne tried to dissuade her. If you go against Mother, she will kill you, and if you touch that thing, perhaps it will kill us both. But Eliza only gripped her sister's shoulders, her eyes burning. Better to die fighting than to live as prisoners to her madness. The house seemed to sense her resolve. Doors slammed without cause, shadows lengthened, and the nursery door rattled on its hinges whenever Eliza drew near. Once, she dared to peer inside. The creature was no longer the size of a newborn. It had grown rapidly, its limbs thickening, its gaze sharp and unblinking. It turned its head toward her with deliberate slowness, and though it made no sound, she understood the message in its eyes. I know what you intend. Still, she did not falter. That night, as rain pattered against the roof, Eliza knelt beside Clara's grave in the overgrown garden. She pressed her forehead against the cold earth, whispering through her tears, I vow it, Clara. I will destroy the cradle, destroy the thing within it, and end Mother's curse, even if it takes my life. The earth beneath her seemed to tremble, as though it had heard her promise. Somewhere deep in the mansion, the abomination let out a cry, not a child's cry, but a howl of fury, as if it too had heard her vow. The night of fire began with whispers. Eliza could no longer bear the sight of the nursery door. Every time she passed, she felt it breathe, yes, breathe, like a great lung of wood and shadow, inhaling her fear. Inside, the cradle rocked without touch, and the creature had grown far too quickly. Its babble was no longer babble at all, but fragments of words, sounds that crawled under the skin like worms. Margaret spent her hours there, cradling the abomination as though it were holy. She sang to it, prayed to it, even fed it with blood from her own palm when milk no longer satisfied. Her journal brimmed with ravings, whole passages in languages no one in Boston knew, words that smelled of rotten thunder when read aloud. Eliza waited until midnight. Anne clung to her, terrified, but Eliza's eyes burned with grim resolve. It ends tonight, she whispered. I swore to Clara, I will not let that thing live another dawn. Armed with a kitchen knife and a hidden flask of lamp oil, Eliza pushed open the nursery door. The air inside was suffocating, thick with heat though no fire burned. The cradle sat in the center, rocking gently. The child thing within turned its head slowly toward her, its black eyes gleaming with knowing malice. It gurgled, then spoke her name. Liza. Her stomach lurched, bile rising in her throat. Yet she stepped forward, teeth clenched. You should never have been born. She uncorked the flask and doused the cradle, the wood drinking greedily. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the abomination screamed, not like an infant but like a man being burned alive. The sound split her ears, rattled the glass in the windows. Shadows surged from the walls, twisting into shapes with teeth and hands. Eliza struck the flint. Flame leapt to life, consuming the oil-soaked cradle in an instant. The nursery erupted into fire, the wallpaper curling black, the swans melting into grotesque forms. The creature writhed inside, its body thrashing against the flames. Yet it did not die quietly. Its cries became words, Curses, promises of vengeance that clawed their way into Eliza's mind. Margaret burst into the room then, her face twisted with rage. "No!" she shrieked, hurling herself toward the burning cradle. "You fool! You've doomed us all!" She tried to snatch the child thing from the fire, but the flames coiled around her like living serpents. Her hair caught, her skin blistered, and she screamed as though her soul itself was being scorched. Anne pulled at Eliza's arm, sobbing, "We have to go. The whole house will burn." But Eliza stood frozen, watching her mother writhe in the inferno, torn between triumph and horror. For in that moment she realized Margaret was right. Destroying the cradle was not salvation. It was release. The fire spread faster than thought, racing along the halls, devouring the drapes, the wood, the very bones of the mansion. As the sisters fled through smoke and falling beams, behind them echoed not just fire, but laughter. The abomination's laughter, mingling with their mother's screams. The Whitmore mansion was burning, but something inside it was not finished. The Whitmore mansion was gone by morning, reduced to a blackened skeleton against the pale sky. Smoke coiled upward like a funeral veil, and the smell of scorched wood and flesh carried for miles. Neighbors, drawn by the fire in the night, gather at a distance, whispering of divine punishment, of witchcraft, of sins too great for heaven to ignore. None dared cross the charred threshold. Eliza and Anne sat shivering on the damp grass at the edge of the estate. Their clothes were torn, their hands blistered, their lungs raw from smoke. Neither spoke for a long time. Only when the last beam collapsed into ash did Anne break the silence. "Do you think it's gone?" she asked, her voice brittle. Eliza's gaze stayed fixed on the ruins. Somewhere deep in her chest, she wanted to believe it. To believe the flames had purged the curse, had consumed the abomination, had ended the nightmare that had begun the moment their mother let greed lead her astray. But she could not lie, not to Anne, not to herself. "No," Eliza whispered. "I heard it in the fire. It laughed." Anne buried her face in her hands, sobbing softly. "Then what hope do we have? If fire cannot kill it, nothing can." Eliza wrapped her arm around her sister, pulling her close. "There is always hope. If it survived, it will hunt us. But we will be ready." Her voice hardened. "Clara died warning us. I will not let her death be in vain." For a time, they sat watching the ruin smolder, the air heavy with loss. Then Eliza rose, her body aching but her will unbroken. She turned her back on the ruins of her childhood home. "Come, Anne. We cannot stay here. We need allies, knowledge, someone who understands what we face." As they walked away, the wind shifted. In the ashes of the nursery, beneath the charred remains of the cradle, something stirred. A faint handprint pressed upward through the soot, impossibly small, impossibly strong. The Whitmore sisters did not look back, but the thing that had been born in their house was not finished with them, not yet. Writing. The Whitmore sisters left Boston before the sun had fully risen, their faces hidden beneath shawls. Eliza carried only a satchel with Clara's Bible and a few coins salvaged from the stables. Anne clutched the rosary that had slipped from her hand the night the fire began. Behind them, whispers spread quickly, neighbors muttering about witchcraft, bargains with devils, the punishment of God. Yet as they walked the muddy road out of town, Eliza felt no relief. The ashes of the mansion still clung to her skin, and worse, she felt eyes upon her. She turned often, scanning the fog-choked fields, but nothing moved, nothing human at least. On the third night, as they took shelter in a decrepit inn outside Salem, Anne woke with a scream. Eliza rushed to her bedside, heart pounding. "What is it?" Anne's face was pale as parchment. "It was at the window," she whispered. "The child. I saw it watching me." Eliza stiffened. She crossed to the window, threw open the shutters, and found only the moonlight spilling across the empty road, but her sister would not be soothed. She clung to Eliza's arm, shaking violently. Its eyes, black as coal, it smiled at me. That night, Eliza did not sleep. She sat awake, knife in hand, staring into the dark corners of the room. More than once, she heard footsteps in the hallway, too light to be a man's, too deliberate to be the creak of settling wood. At one point, the door rattled, though no one entered. By morning, they pressed onward. Each mile carried them farther from Boston, yet the shadow followed. Crows gathered along the treetops, their beady eyes fixed on the sisters as they walked. Once Anne swore she heard the faint cry of a baby carried on the wind, though they were miles from any village. Eliza's resolve only hardened. "It wants to break us," she told her sister, "but I will not falter. Whatever it is, wherever it came from, there must be someone who knows how to fight it. Priests, scholars, even madmen. Someone must know." Anne said nothing. Her gaze stayed on the road behind them, where faint footprints, small, childlike, and burned into the dirt, disappeared whenever Eliza turned to look. The abomination had survived the fire, and now it was hunting them. Writing. The sisters reached the outskirts of a dense forest by dusk, weary and desperate for shelter. Eliza urged Anne onward, but every step carried with it the sense of being pursued, as though the trees themselves bent inward to watch. They found a clearing and made a small fire. For a moment, the flickering light gave them comfort, but soon Anne's hands began to tremble. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Eliza stilled. Beyond the crackle of the fire, the forest seemed alive with whispers. Bray, anks creaking though the air was still. Soft giggles like children playing hide-and-seek. Then came the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps circling the clearing. Eliza gripped her knife, forcing her breath steady. "Stay close to the fire," she commanded. "It fears the light." But even as she said it, she doubted herself. The laughter came again, closer this time, low and mocking. A stone skittered across the ground, thrown from the shadows, then another. Soon, rocks pelted the fire from every direction, trying to snuff it out. Anne cried out and covered her head. Eliza leapt to her feet, slashing her blade at the darkness. "Show yourself!" she roared. For a moment the forest fell silent. Then, just beyond the reach of the fire, a figure appeared, small, childlike, its body charred black, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally. It smiled, revealing teeth sharp as glass. "Eliza!" it cooed in a voice like cracking timber. "Sister!" Anne shrieked and clutched Eliza's arm, but Eliza stepped forward, fury and terror warring within her. "You will not have us!" she spat. The creature tilted its head further, eyes glowing faintly like embers. Then, in a blur of impossible speed, it darted around the clearing, circling them, its laughter echoing from every angle. The fire guttered in the wind it stirred. Eliza realized then that they were not hunters, they were prey. In desperation, she seized a burning branch from the fire and thrust it into the darkness. The creature hissed, recoiling, its body dissolving momentarily into smoke before reforming. It could be hurt, she realized, but not destroyed. Not yet. "We run!" Eliza gasped, dragging Anne to her feet. With the torch in one hand and the knife in the other, she pulled her sister into the forest. Branches tore at their skin, roots clawed at their boots, but still they ran, pursued by laughter that never grew fainter. By the time the moon reached its height, they stumbled into a ruined chapel hidden in the woods. Its doors hung from rusted hinges, its windows shattered. Yet as they crossed the threshold, the laughter stopped. Anne collapsed, sobbing in relief. Eliza stared into the glare-yin of the chapel, chest heaving. The creature had not followed them inside. Something in these broken walls, these long-forgotten stones, had repelled it. For the first time since the fire, hope flickered. But the hunt was not over. The shadow knew where they were now, and it would not stop. Writing. The ruined chapel smelled of mildew and rot, its pews broken, its altar cracked down the middle like a wound that never healed. Moss crept along the walls, and moonlight poured in through shattered glass, casting fractured patterns on the stone floor. Yet even in its decay, the place felt sanctified. The air inside was heavy, yes, but not with malice. It was a weight that pressed down on the sisters like unseen hands, keeping the darkness at bay. Anne slumped against a pew, whispering prayers between gasps. Eliza stood watch, her torch burning low, listening to the silence. Outside, the forest remained restless, but the creature's laughter had ceased. It was there, waiting, but it could not cross the threshold. Eliza's eyes roved the chapel until they caught on something carved into the altar. Faint etchings, symbols unlike any she had seen in her Bible. She leaned closer, tracing them with her fingers. The grooves burned cold against her skin. Words whispered in the back of her mind, not in English, not in Latin, but in the same tongue Margaret had scribbled in her journals. "Eliza." Anne's voice shook. "Don't touch it." But Eliza ignored her, compelled. The carvings spoke of a covenant, of shadows bound in flesh, of children not born, but made. Beneath the altar lay a hollow chamber, hidden by a slab of stone. With effort she pried it open, coughing as dust billowed into the air. Inside lay brittle pages bound in cracked leather. The book was no Bible. Its pages were filled with ink the color of dried blood, diagrams of figures half human, half demon, and prayers twisted into curses. At the back of the book, an entry had been added in a trembling hand. "The womb is a gate. If opened, it must be sealed. Burn the flesh, bury the ashes in holy ground, and let no tongue speak its name." Eliza's stomach churned. This chapel had not been abandoned. It had been sealed long ago, as if someone knew the same darkness had touched these woods before. Anne clutched her rosary tighter, eyes wide. "Eliza, this is worse than we thought. Mother didn't summon it by accident. She repeated something ancient, something cursed." Eliza closed the book, her resolve tightening like a fist. "Then we will finish what they could not. If fire alone could not kill it, then we will use this knowledge. We will find the rites. We will seal the gate for good." From outside came a low, guttural cry. The abomination circling the chapel walls, clawing at the stones, furious at being kept out. The sound reverberated through the broken windows, but the sisters held their ground. For the first time, Eliza felt they had a weapon. A fragile one, yes, but a weapon all the same. And she vowed in that moment she would not rest until the shadow stalking them was buried forever. The chapel had given them a secret, but secrets came with a price, and the thing outside was patient. Writing. The sisters did not sleep that night. The chapel floor was cold, the air thick with dust, but the greater weight pressing on them was the book. Its cracked leather binding seemed almost alive, as if pulsing faintly with each breath the sisters took. Eliza kept it on the altar, afraid to let it touch the ground. Anne sat beside the dwindling fire, her rosary clicking as she whispered prayers. "This book is evil," she murmured, refusing to look at it. "We should burn it." Eliza shook her head. "If it held answers once, it still does. Clara begged me to end this thing, Anne. If this is the only path forward, I will walk it." By the pale light of dawn, Eliza opened the book again. The pages smelled of iron, like blood left too long in the sun. Each diagram, each sigil, seemed to move when she stared too long, curling into shapes that whispered. One passage described how shadows could cling to wombs, gestating in place of God's creation. Another detailed rituals of sealing, the use of consecrated fire, salt, and the heart's blood of the summoner. Eliza's breath caught at those words. "Mother," she whispered. Could Margaret have been the key all along? And if so, what did it mean now that she had burned in the nursery? Anne noticed the look in her sister's eyes and shook her head violently. "Don't say it. Don't even think it. You can't mean—" "I mean we must understand the cost," Eliza said firmly. "If sealing requires sacrifice, then we must be prepared." Before Anne could reply, a heavy thud struck the chapel wall. Dust rained from the rafters. Another blow followed, then another, until the stones themselves seemed ready to crack. The abomination was hurling itself against the barrier, shrieking in fury. The sisters clapped their hands to their ears as the sound pierced like nails. Eliza snapped the book shut, her resolve sharpening. "It knows we've found something. It fears this knowledge," Anne trembled. "Or it wants us to use it." The blows ceased. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. When Eliza dared to peek through the broken window, she saw nothing but the forest swaying in the wind. Yet in the dirt outside, she noticed fresh marks, symbols carved with clawed fingers, matching those etched into the book. It was mocking them, mimicking them. That night, Eliza pressed her hand to the altar and whispered a prayer that was half desperation, half defiance. If this book was left for us, then let it guide us. And if it was left as a curse, then I will turn it against the one who stalks us. The shadows in the chapel seemed to stir in answer. The sisters clung to each other, listening to the silence outside, knowing it would not last. The Book of Blood had given them knowledge, but knowledge was never free. Writing. The chapel felt colder the next night, as though the very stones recoiled from what the sisters planned. Eliza spread the Book of Blood across the cracked altar, its pages fluttering despite the still air. The script seemed to writhe under the candlelight, urging her onward. Anne stood back, her rosary clutched tight. "This is madness," she whispered. "We'll damn ourselves." "We're damned already," Eliza replied, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. She arranged a circle of salt across the chapel floor, each line carefully measured against the diagrams in the book. At the circle's center, she placed a jar of oil and a wooden crucifix taken from the ruined pews. Fire and faith, the book had written, both needed to bind the shadow. The sisters worked in silence, only the sound of grains scattering breaking the air. Outside, the forest stirred. Branches snapped, low growls drifted through the cracks, and once, horribly, a child's voice sang a lullaby, the same Margaret used to hum. When the circle was complete, Eliza cut her palm with the knife and let the blood drip into the salt. The grains hissed as though alive, glowing faintly for a heartbeat before darkening again. Anne whimpered, but Eliza's gaze never left the book. She began the chant. The words rasped against her throat, each syllable tasting of iron and ash. The air thickened, the chapel's shadows lengthening as if leaning closer. Anne tried to join in, stumbling over the syllables, her voice breaking. Then, with a crash like thunder, the chapel doors burst inward. The abomination stood framed in the threshold, its charred body writhing, its eyes twin coals. The barrier faltered but did not break. The salt glowed brighter, repelling it like flame. The creature screamed, the sound rattling the windows and shaking dust from the rafters. It clawed against the invisible wall, and each strike sent cracks through the stones of the chapel. Anne shrieked, covering her ears, while Eliza's voice grew louder, stronger, defiant. The crucifix ignited. Fire leapt upward, unnatural and white-hot, filling the circle with blinding light. For a moment the creature faltered, its form flickering, its laughter turning into a howl of pain. But the book had not lied. The ritual demanded more. The light sputtered, faltering, and the abomination surged forward once more. Anne's voice shook. "Eliza, it's not enough!" Eliza's eyes fell to the line of text she had tried to ignore. The final offering, the heart's blood of the summoner. Her chest tightened. She realized then that the book had never promised victory without sacrifice, and the shadow knew it. That was why it laughed even now. The ritual had begun, but to finish it, one of the sisters might have to die. The chapel shook with each strike of the abomination's claws, the walls groaning as though the forest itself demanded entry. The salt circle glowed faintly, flickering with every blow. Eliza's voice grew raw as she forced the chant from her throat, but she knew the words alone would never be enough. Anne clutched her arm. "Stop! You'll kill yourself!" Her eyes were wild with terror, her lips trembling as she looked at the knife glinting in Eliza's hand. "It wants your blood, Eliza. That's what the book says. That's the trap." Eliza's breath came fast, sweat streaking her soot-stained face. "No, it is the price. All binding requires sacrifice. If I end it here, it dies with me." Anne shook her head furiously, tears streaming. "I won't let you. You're all I have left. Clara's gone, Mother's gone. If you die, I'm alone." The abomination shrieked again, its body pressing harder against the invisible barrier. Cracks ran through the chapel stones, dust raining from above. The crucifix in the circle flickered with fire, wavering. The protection would not last much longer. Eliza's eyes softened for a moment as she looked at her sister. "Then promise me, Anne. If it takes me, you finish the rite. Don't let me die for nothing. But Anne's grip tightened, desperate. "No, there has to be another way. We'll find one together." The shadow creature slammed against the wall, a long arm snaking through a gap in the stones. Its claws scraped across the floorboards, reaching, grasping. The salt hissed angrily where it touched, but the line was thinning. Eliza raised the blade, her chest heaving. She whispered Clara's name, then Anne's, her voice breaking. "Forgive me." But before she could plunge it into her chest, Anne screamed and struck the knife from her hand. "If blood is needed, then it will be mine." Eliza caught her sister's wrist just in time, her face pale with horror. For a heartbeat, the sisters struggled, their grief and love tearing them apart. Outside, the abomination laughed, a deep, echoing sound that filled the chapel like a victory hymn. The book had not lied. The ritual demanded blood. But whose blood it would take remained undecided, and the choice would shatter them both. The chapel became a battlefield of will and blood. The abomination's claws scraped deeper, the salt circle splintering under its rage. The book of blood pulsed on the altar, its pages fluttering wildly, as if urging them toward the final step. Eliza and Anne clung to one another, the knife between them. Neither would let go. Both were willing, yet both terrified. Tears streaked their smoke-blackened faces. "Clara wanted it ended," Eliza gasped, pressing her forehead against her sister's. "We can't fail her." Anne shook her head, sobbing. "I can't lose you, not after everything." The creature shrieked, its laughter blending into a cry so loud the windows so hattered. Shadows poured into the chapel like liquid, slamming against the circle. The crucifix's white fire sputtered. The choice could not wait. Eliza's resolve hardened. She kissed Anne's brow, a mother's gesture though she was only a sister. Then, with a strength born of desperation, she twisted the knife free. Anne's scream echoed as Eliza drove the blade into her own chest. Pain exploded, her blood splattering across the salt. The circle flared like the sun, fire rushing outward in a roaring wave. The abomination wailed, caught in the blaze. Its body writhed, splitting, the shadows that made it unraveling into smoke. It clawed at the air, its black eyes burning holes into Eliza's soul. But she did not falter. With her final breath, she forced the last words of the chant through her lips. The chapel blazed white. The creature's form twisted, screamed, and then was gone. Consumed, bound, sealed in the ashes. Anne cradled Eliza in her arms as the fire dimmed. "No, please, no," she wept, rocking her sister's lifeless body. But Eliza's eyes, soft and unafraid, stared upward at the cracked ceiling. Peace had found her at last. The book of blood lay silent, its pages now blank, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. The chapel grew still again, the shadows gone, the air lighter. At dawn, Anne buried her sister beneath the altar, marking the grave with the rosary she had once clutched so tightly. Her hands shook as she whispered, "You won, Eliza. You kept your vow." She left the chapel that morning with nothing but grief and a fire in her heart. She would carry Eliza's story, Clara's memory, and the horror of their mother's choices. The Whitmore line would not be forgotten, nor the price paid to end the curse. As she walked into the pale light of the forest, the ruins of the widow's legacy smoldered behind her. Boston would whisper of the Whitmore fire, of strange sightings in the woods, of a curse that ended in blood. But only Anne knew the truth. Her sister's sacrifice had sealed the gate. For now,